the West of today is a continual war between the good and the true. And the the partisans for the true will trot out the beautiful as a weapon against the good, and the against the partisans of the good. And the partisans of the good are extremely distrustful of the beautiful because they to them it's a it's a trick from the partisans of the true. So yeah, and in today's world, if the truth is your thing, then you're likely to migrate to the Roman Catholic Church, and if the good is your thing, then you migrate and say more an evangelical, because the highlight of goodness is efficiency, and an evangelical can give you a much more efficient approach to salvation, more effective, more secure, more assured, all these things. So in that, we don't want to get caught up in that war between the true and the good. It's a fruitless thing, and we want to call everyone, including the Orthodox, back to the ancient way, which is beauty, goodness, truth.
Dr. Timothy Patitsas, thank you so much for being here today.
Austin, thank you. Thanks for bringing me on.
I've really been looking forward to this. In fact, your book has been one that's been recommended to me several times, and it hasn't been the volume of recommendations, but the enthusiasm with which it's recommended when it is that has really made me think like this is one
Mm.
I have to get around to because it's the kind of book that people read and they come away different. And I can't necessarily give a book higher praise than that. But we're talking about your book, The Ethics of Beauty, and immediately at the title, I think people are going to say, "Well, that's an interesting pairing, ethics and beauty." And I imagine the surprise with which people might have over the combination of those two things is going to depend on what they think ethics is and what they think beauty is. And so maybe we could just start with ethics. What do you think is kind of the prevailing view of, I don't know, the nature of ethics, what it is we're talking about when we talk about ethics?
So I think that ethics is is the rational investigation of morality, and I think what we think of it as something that is we start with something that's irrational, like our moral beliefs, our moral prejudices, let's say. Then we want to examine those intellectually to get to ethics, to get to some kind of a some kind of a rational formulation of things that everyone can agree on, irrespective of their religion, their culture, whatever background they have. So ethics is a kind of attempt to transcend, personal or tribal prejudice in favor of, a rational, a rationalized morality.
That's helpful. And I think it's going to lead people to think, so if ethics is about rational morality, what does that have to do with beauty? And I think that might reveal what we think about beauty because for many people, I think beauty is going to be the flip side of the coin of rationality in a way, right? Like if rationality is us being kind of critical and analytical in our thinking, beauty seems more ethereal. It seems harder to pin down.
Yeah.
When when you talk about beauty, what do you mean by beauty?
So I mean, I think there's a lot more context, to put into even like what ethics is. But certainly, I'm kind of a Neoplatonist. At any rate, I was a student for 4 semesters of Eric Pearl, who wrote Theophany. And he wrote this beautiful book summarizing the Neoplatonic philosophy, and he was my philosophy professor at Catholic U. Um, and in the Neoplatonist view, um, there's a continuum of cognition, and so cognition isn't limited to what we know rationally or analytically with that sort of that what Ian McGilchrist would say, just that left hemisphere of the brain. But our aesthetic sense is our primary in time cognitive sense. Now, that aesthetic sense has to be trained, it has to be purified. If you're a Christian, you think it has to be, part of a general purification of the heart from sin, from the passions. Um, but nevertheless, it is a cognitive capacity, your aesthetic sense. And the simple proof of this, is much easier. Let's say if you subscribe to an evolutionary timeline that there's been life on Earth for 2 billion years or 2.5 billion years, whatever it is. But the cerebral cortex is a latecomer to this story. And living things have been processing information and making, correct uh, responses to their environment and to the situations they face solely on the basis of aesthesis for billions of years. And all that capacity for aesthetic knowing, is part of our apparatus. Um, yeah, so that's so I think we live in a culture somehow which thinks of beauty as either prettiness or as a kind of a frivolous adornment, as something irrational. But evolution itself would tell us that there's more to the messages that we get through aesthesis than just, sentimentality.
That's helpful. And, it strikes me that when we often talk about beauty, the first thing that people want to say is like, well, is beauty just in the eyes of the beholder? Is beauty subjective or objective? And it seems to me that that might be an important question, but I'm not sure it's the only question here. How do you look at that kind of the nature of the subjective or objectivity of beauty? Is that important to the role it plays in ethics, or is it a different question we should be asking?
I think we want a healthy dose of subjectivity in the interest of peace. If, all 4 billion men on the planet fall in love with the same one and only woman, we we will kill each other, right? It's so it's the uniqueness of each person, you know, predisposes us to love and admire certain things and not others. And then, of course, there is cultural background and cultural training. Um, but I think C.S. Lewis is right, in reflecting on the importance of the canon. And when we look at a canon of anything, whether it's folk music or scripture, somehow over time communities are good at filtering, and communities are good at rank ordering beauties. And communities too, I think, are good at leaving, room for individuality and for evolution of what's considered beautiful. So I don't think that's really a slam dunk. I mean that it might be subjective, it might be objective. It's both, and it should be both.
Hey, I hope you guys are enjoying this video, but one thing I know people don't always enjoy is the ads that go with these videos. Now look, ads are how YouTubers like me are able to pay the bills, but if you want to watch these videos early, ad-free, and with my post-show reflections at the end, you can do so by becoming a patron at any tier by going to patreon.com/gospelsimplicity. From $7 a month to $100 a month, your support helps this channel keep going and growing, and not only will you get early ad-free access to these interviews, but you will also get access to the Gospel Simplicity book club where we read the church fathers together, and it is an absolute blast. So if you want those perks and others, go to patreon.com/gospelsimplicity. I tend to agree for what it's worth. It seems that it's the type of thing like we were taught, I feel like really early on, this question, is it subjective or objective? And we seem to think that, oh, if it's subjective, it's therefore meaningless. But pretty much everything in our life comes to us through our first person experience of being subjects. And so I think it's a slightly problematic way of framing things. I understand the point, like it's a valid question, but I don't think it has the weight that a lot of people think it does. But I understand that when we then bring beauty into the conversation around ethics, it might make people a little concerned. They want to think, there is an objective morality. There is, right and wrong, regardless of whether I think it's right or wrong. And if we take a beauty first approach to ethics, which you talk about in your book, does this become a problem, or is it going to be the type of thing like where if beauty has this dose of subjectivity, does ethics as well? How do those things relate?
I think yeah, these are good questions, and I like the way you're phrasing them. I think ethics needs some dose of subjectivity, because you are not humanity in general. You are you, and you are living your particular life, and um, and particular duties arise, and particular commitments arise, which have to be played out. Um, but I think when I'm looking at beauty first, I have in mind a sequence among the transcendentals that among the true, the good, and the beautiful, beauty comes first. And the proper sequence is beauty unfolding into beauty plus goodness, unfolding into beauty plus goodness plus truth. In other words, it's a concentric unfolding. It's not a sequential leaving behind. And this shape, this shape of beauty, goodness, truth is the philosophical and, for me as a theologian, really the theological. It corresponds in theology to Ian McGilchrist's book, The Master and His Emissary, his account of how all bicameral brains think. Um, and, you know, and he says for 400 million years, since the earliest bicameral fossils the brains that we have are bicameral. And it's, for him, it's right hemisphere, left hemisphere, right hemisphere. And that's an appreciation of the wholeness, a passing off to analytical reason, and then a handing back to the wholeness for incorporation into a larger cosmic vision. And he says all things with brains follow this threefold path, and so it's really what I'm doing in my book is playing with that shape, that the beauty, goodness, truth sequence is the right brain, right brain sequence of McGilchrist. It is the grammar, logic, rhetoric of the trivium. In Orthodoxy, in the Philokalia, it's purification, illumination, deification. It's loves, it's eros, agape, philia. That it's the ubiquity of that shape that I'm after in my book. To say that, and I hadn't read McGilchrist when I wrote the book, so he's not in there, but the others all are, and and understanding why cognitively and spiritually, and then there's a big emphasis in my book on psychological recovery. Um, so psychologically, that's the sequence you've got to follow for human wholeness. Is this whatever names you put on it? That sequence is the sequence. It's the way. This is the way. The kid is coming with me. In the words of the Mandalorian, this is the way. This is how it has to be.
So I want to put some skin on that idea for people,
Please, please,
because
sorry.
no, I think this is really good, and I think um, it's really conceptually rich. And as we maybe unfold what this looks like practically, it might help people then come back to seeing how this is what they're doing in other cases. So you mentioned a bit about kind of like psychological healing, which I want to talk about in a bit, because it seems like you talk
Sure,
about trauma as like the anti-beauty, which is really interesting to me. And
sure, sure, yeah.
we'll get there in 1 second. Before we get there, maybe we could go with like a positive example of, in ethics, what does it look like for us to take this, was it right, left, right? Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, this kind of approach or beauty first. Like,
Or,
could we take an
yeah.
ethical idea and see how that fleshes out with us?
So yeah, so if you think in terms of the ethics of the Christian faith, we start with some kind of a grammar, and that stage of just an observation of what is. In that sense, the beautiful in that case just means, this this fullness that has been given to us of the life in Christ. So we look among the saints, and whether it's capital S or small s, saints matters not. We look for the patterns of how the faithful have lived, and that's our first, a kind of accounting. Some of these patterns, um, uh, you know, some of the patterns are quite specifically, enjoined as duties within other theophanic experiences, right? Like on Mount Sinai, commands are given, right? So within that beautiful experience of theophany, commands are given. So within what is, we look for the patterns, and then in a university context, now we're trying to discuss what might be the principles underlying those patterns. What is the principle that says, for example, is it permissible for Christians to cremate their dead? Right. So we have some kind of pattern, or patterns across time, across culture. We have the writings of church fathers or scriptural writings about the body, or even about in the body after death. And then we look for principles. And now we're at the goodness stage, the analytical stage. And the truth stage is daring to take our our personal analysis and share it with the church for a broader discussion. You can't really do analysis in a committee. I mean, you're going to go off and figure it out, but then you have to return to the conversation. So the truth stage corresponds to rhetoric in as much as we want to have that conversation with the larger body of Christ about what we might think is the ethical code here on the treatment of the body after death in this example. And then what we'd really, really like, we'd like to be so rhetorical, so interpersonal, in other words, that at the end we say, it seemed good to the Holy Spirit and to us. And so we've gone from, a kind of sifting through the evidence to an analysis of it, to some kind of a discussion and right. That's a pretty straightforward way to think of things, right? I mean, it's pretty non-controversial. Um, but it was very controversial for science until gross test came along, right? In other words, science was totally stuck. There was observation, then there was analysis. Science had no real way to 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 approach the rhetorical stage, and it does this through the falsifiable hypothesis, and it does this through, you know, what's the phrase for empirical results that can be repeated, are repeatable by others. So without that third stage, you do not have truth. You do not have science. So without the falsifiable without coming back into conversation with the whole.
Yeah, and just as an aside, it seems like there's been a lot of movement in the world of like sociology, especially lately, that's struggling on that kind of brink of doing a really interesting study and then seeing if it can actually be repeated. I'm thinking of the books like Thinking Fast and Slow have come under some criticism for
Uh,
repeatability for things like this, and various kind of popularizing bestsellers of whether or not we can actually get these results again. That's aside, and I don't know enough about it to properly weigh in, but it's just interesting to see that issue of getting to the third stage. I want to pause for a second to talk about that first stage, because it seems that beauty is here related to, so was it sifting the evidence, analyzing, and then kind of putting forth the claim? Beauty would have
yes.
been the first one there, the sifting. Is it a noticing? I want to just highlight this because I think when people
Yes.
think of beauty, I don't know if that's what they recognize they're doing. So help me
Yeah, there's
understand
a lot.
it.
There's a lot of things going on in my mind, right? Like if beauty here in this case means that we approach the world as gift and not merely as dead given, right? We approach the world, or we respect the isness of things, right? That already is a kind of nod to beauty. It's it's for one thing, it's a decentering of an um, overly anthropocentric or overly, in the case of the individual, overly self-enclosed approach to the world, right? There's some world out there that summons me outside myself, right? That's eros. And that eros for me may be not be dramatic, right? It may be quiet and peaceful. It may be just a noticing, a quiet noticing of things that, you know, are right in front of me. But nevertheless, there is an erotic dimension to that because it's what Alan Bloom called love's mad self-forgetting, in Eros, that somehow you are given the world its due as something that is, you know.
Yeah, that reminds me. I don't know if you're familiar with Elaine Scarry's work on beauty and being just, but I was talking about this on my channel the other day. She talks about one of the ways that beauty leads to justice is that very act of decentering. The idea that in recognizing
Mm.
something as beautiful, I'm recognizing I'm putting value on that and not on myself. I'm moving myself to the periphery, which she talks about as kind of like a forerunner to justice. I only highlight that because I've
It
made a
it
video
it,
about
it
that
really
recently.
is. It really is. Yeah, that's it. And I think, yeah, the term beauty, right? Like it would be nice if I could, from the get-go, invest it with some full definition. And really what I'm looking at is a shape that keeps showing up, this threefold concentric unfolding. This is a shape. And that first shape, the first stage in that shape, in any field, has something to teach us about what beauty is. I don't want to define beauty because I don't I want I don't want to give people um it's this beautiful book by Catherine Pickstock, After Writing. And she has, Socrates in one of the dialogues, and he draws the young man outside the city for a conversation, and the young man is so smug because he has all the writings of his instructor on a scroll in his tunic. And it's this question of, that writing somehow it writing is kind of the defeat of eros in this context. It's taking the knowledge, digesting it so completely within that eros is now optional. And so beauty for me works as a word and as a term that helps people to save their soul, that when they hear it can get them outside the imprisonment in the self. And it works.
It really does. It Beauty has this tremendous capacity to kind of shift the way that we're moving about in the world, to put it, I guess, a bit obliquely. But it has a way of slowing us down, of noticing, of changing the way that we're moving in our lives. And I guess one question I want to ask here is, you mentioned that every discipline is going to kind of follow this threefold shape, and that beauty is going to take the beginning of that. When we're putting out this view of beauty itself, and then kind of the ethics of beauty here, is this is there a prescriptive element to this? And what I mean by that is, are you just describing what is already happening? Like, no matter how you're thinking, no matter what discipline you're
Mm.
in, no matter how you're doing ethics, like, you're already doing it this way, whether you realize it or not. Or is there an additional aspect to your project that sees, okay, maybe like the general shape is this way, but by recognizing this, or there's new ways that we can engage in doing ethics or any number of things by recognizing and investing in that first stage of beauty? Does that make sense? The distinction between noticing
Yeah.
we're already doing this versus kind of commending that people do it this way.
Yeah, but see, I feel I like your question, but I'm worried that it might be, you know, that, it's subtly an argument for the primacy of the good. In other words,
Mm.
show me the practical impact of this. And I think it's just a cool shape. And I think, when the sooner you kind of arrive to that, and the sooner you kind of can kind of laugh about how its ubiquity, and it's just not going away. It's very resilient, and it's the shape has been around. Um, the Greeks had the shape, and it was sort of this acting, thinking, knowing is another way, another form of this. And they didn't come up with it. I mean, it was old when they got it, and they got it from the Egyptians or the Babylonians, from really old peoples. So it's not going anywhere. And now that we have McGilchrist on our side, I don't think it ever will. So clearly there is some prescriptive use, like let's not bang our heads against the wall. But since from the standpoint of orthodoxy, of Orthodox Christianity, which in some ways is at the stands as the source code of the West, especially Greek Orthodoxy, right? In some senses, it's both the source code for Christianity and for just the West as Hellenism. Um, the West of today is a continual war between the good and the true, and the partisans for the true will trot out the beautiful as a weapon against the good, and the against the partisans of the good, and the partisans of the good are extremely distrustful of the beautiful, because they to them it's a trick from the partisans of the true. So yeah, and in today's world, if the truth is your thing, then you're likely to migrate to the Roman Catholic Church, and if the good is your thing, then you migrate, let's say, more an evangelical, because the highlight of goodness is efficiency, and an evangelical can give you a much more efficient approach to salvation, more effective, more secure, more assured, all these things. So in that, we don't want to get caught up in that war between the true and the good. It's a fruitless thing, and we want to call everyone, including the Orthodox, back to the ancient way, which is beauty, goodness, truth. Sorry, I mean it's too simplistic. Forgive me for, but we do tend to look at everything in terms of efficacy, efficiency. In the words of Robert Moses, I'm also a great disciple of Jane Jacobs, as you may know, and her well, she was his nemesis. He really wasn't hers. She defeated him fairly easily. But Robert Moses famously said, "The important thing is to get things done." So he was the apostle of the good.
I think it would be interesting to expand on this a bit, and I really appreciate that kind of broad overview you've given there. If evangelicalism is maybe the church of the good, or like over-indexing on the good, if we want to put it that way, maybe to the exclusion of other things. Roman Catholicism is emphasizing the true, maybe it, without sufficient kind of appreciation for the others. What would it look like to be a church of beauty? Because I think the first thing that's going to come to people's mind is like, oh, we are going to put really beautiful icons in it, or we're going to
Yeah,
appreciate fine art.
yeah,
And sure, that could be a
yeah.
part of it, but I sense you mean something a lot more than like we've got pretty things to be a church of beauty.
Right. Yeah, it is. Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, for me, writing the ethics of beauty started when a student who was not Orthodox asked about a passage in Lars Thunberg's massive book, Microcosm and Mediator, which is the theological anthropology of Maximus the Confessor. And Thunberg says that, hey, the earliest East-West, not really split or schism, but the first, rift was whether the sensual sins are the first line of defense to defend against in the spiritual life, or the intellectual sins. So the intellectual sins like pride in particular. So is humility your first approach, or is your first concern, or is chastity? And so writing the Ethics of Beauty was kind of an act of recovery. Um, like Jane Jacobs, I'm interested in this question of dark ages and how they hit us. And I couldn't find another Orthodox Christian who could explain to me what this distinction meant. But Thunberg says it's absolutely primary. It is the thing. Why did the East say that you start in combating the sensual sins and not the intellectual sins, which would seem much more normal, right? And it seems more rational too, right? Because rationally speaking, you've got to get clear on things, and pride is this big confusion. Well, the matter can be smoothed out somewhat. You can kind of square that circle to a degree. Um, but before I got to that point, I went to a monastery in upstate New York, and to one of the so-called Father Ephrem monasteries of the North American Orthodox landscape. And I just asked the abbot, and he said, "This is the most important question I've been asked in many years, and it is to answer it, you have to know what is the purpose of everything we do as monks." So certainly within the there is an unbroken tradition in the East, going back to the fourth century and past, emphasizing this beauty first approach, which is that your gaze has to be on fixed stably on Christ, and in so doing, you cut off self-love, the bad forms of self-love. Not you cultivate the good forms of self-love, but you cut off bad self-love. You defeat this self-enclosure. You live by eros. And when you do that, all the passions are cut off at the root, including pride, including gluttony, including lust. So it's all about it seems rather Buddhist almost. It's like this kind of course it's the opposite of Buddhism too, but it's in the sense that attention is very important, right? What giving stable attention to Christ. Yeah, I could say more, but I feel like your listeners deserve a break and a question.
Oh no, this was wonderful, and I'm just trying to imagine. This is probably maybe not the first thing that you should be thinking, but having an abbot tell you that this is the question had to
Yeah.
feel pretty good, like when you're working on a book project. Maybe also very intimidating. Like, okay, now we have to get down to the very bottom of everything, and but at the same time, I think that's really intriguing that this question of the sensual sins versus the sins of the mind, if you will, is at the root of this. And so it seems like part of the answer you were giving there is to pay much attention to our attention. And you were saying you have more on that, and I'd love to hear how, and not to put this in an overly, pragmatic sense, right? But when the monk was connecting that to everything he was doing, can you help me see that a little bit? Because I think some people might not yet appreciate how what the monastic lifestyle has to do with the attention specifically.
A few years ago, we had an event at our Meliodas Cultural Center, and it was sort of like a Greek Jewish love fest. I don't know what this thing was, but it was packed. And Father George Dragas and some leaders from the Jewish community had organized this thing. And it was just sort of like, this evening of mutual praise and discussion of the long, thousands of years that Greeks and Jews have been, relating and inspiring. And, well, I suppose in the case of the Greeks, destroying the temple, desecrating the temple, but God forgive us. Anyway, I had this thought, watching the thing. My comic thought was, 2,000 years later, all the Jews are dressed like Romans. They're clean shaven, tie, suits. They are good to go. And all the Greeks are dressed like first century Palestine rabbis. Long black robes, beards. So there's always things. Cultures have a way of coming over each other. What was the question? I lost the question. That made me think of that.
I love
Yeah,
that it
what was
made
your?
you think of that. I was asking about the importance of our attention and how that related to kind of the monastic ideal there, because the abbot seemed to be saying that this question was at the
Yes,
heart of everything and their whole life revolved around this.
the West is too Greek. This is the problem, and it's lost some essential Semitic thing, which is the way of the heart. Now, there are certainly spiritual mystical traditions throughout Western Christianity that aim for that, right? But it's no longer like the way. It's not the thing. It's something within it, right? There are orders in the Roman Catholic Church that do this, or there, or whatever. But um, the purpose of the monk is to place the mind, this Greek mind, this intellect, whatever, in the heart, in the Semitic heart. So this is a kind of quieting of the mind, a kind of defeating of the mind's analytical capacity, temporarily at least, and focus on the name of Christ, the name of God, the name of Jesus Christ, and the Jesus prayer. So that, and when they attempt that, the abbot went on to say, what pulls them away is some feeling, some emotional disturbance, an image, maybe in the form of a memory or in the form of a temptation, uh, a memory of a wrong that has been done. Also, what pulls you away are just your own tiredness, your own hunger, your own sleepiness, your fatigue, whatever it is, and your sickness. So to defeat the sensual sins, in other words, is to stay in stable focus on the name of Christ, despite all those sensual things pulling you away. Now, also in intellectual things, ideas pop into your mind, but for the fathers, those two are kind of like images. Do not investigate the image. Imageless prayer is the so the idea is that then this produces some kind of a fusion between the mind and the heart, and the when the mind doesn't is called to analysis, it can be done in a way that is not so violent and destructive. Yeah. So
I
that's what it looks like for them. Yeah.
that's that's beautiful. It no pun intended. It reminds me of a really interesting claim you make in the preface or introduction at the very beginning of your book, that what you're attempting to do is akin to the Philokalia, but in prose. I think you put it that way. Not in the sense that it's on the same shelf. You're very humble in it, but that you're trying to get at the same thing. A lot of my viewers will probably be familiar in passing with the Philokalia, but talk to me a little bit more about that self-conception of what it was you were setting out to do through talking about the ethics of beauty, and how that is essentially related to a wonderful classic text on prayer.
Yeah, that's a good question. So the Philokalia is writings spanning, I think, like 1,200 years or something, that were compiled in the 17th century or 18th century by Saint Nicodemus the Hierite. And according to, he's no longer a professor at Holy Cross, but my former colleague and friend, Father Maximus Constas, it was compiled partly with a view to the Enlightenment. They could see that the Enlightenment was aiming at a kind of materialistic, a material version of the threefold levels of knowing, And they wanted to show this more important realm of the threefold levels of knowing, which, by the way, the three levels, which sometimes are called purification, illumination, deification, I mean, they have many names. There's many names for the levels, depending on the writer and the era. The name isn't the thing. The thing is the shape. The shape is the same. So, so the Philokalia is, something that people read to inspire themselves in a monastic context, typically, and in the context that they have some rule of prayer, usually communally supported, that they are devoting X amount of minutes or hours a day, or to the Jesus prayer, or through that trying to approach their spiritual their concourse with God, not through discursive reasoning, but through what we call the nous, which is somehow this more integrated faculty of knowing that we possess. As the mind descends into the heart, it's activated and purified, and and by the way, and I often will say, I mean, that I think this beauty first approach, if you look for it in the Roman Catholic Church today, I know many people that I have known all my life, many Roman Catholics who strive to go to Mass every day, and of course I've known even more friends in the evangelical Protestant world who are spending that 30 minutes every day with the Bible. To me, and maybe a journal and maybe a cup of coffee. But that, like the Jesus prayer, is a beauty first approach, right? There's this, if you let it be, if you let it be, it is a beauty first. If you go in and confuse yourself with your journaling, then it's another story. But you can place your mind and your heart as you read through Scripture, and let this gift be its dynamic self.
I really like that. And we made this distinction early on, but I want to return to it here just in case anyone is having this pop up in their head. We made a distinction between like just sentimentality and beauty. And so when someone hears that, hey, if you let it be, this can be a beauty first approach, can you help them see how that's maybe just what that looks like a little bit more and distinguish it from just like a sentimentality?
Hmm. I don't know that I can operationalize it very well. I feel myself, you getting worse as I get older, I would say. It seems. And I feel myself more and more as a creature of the sacraments of the Orthodox Church. In other words, I went to liturgy this morning. It's Transfiguration for both of us. Happy Transfiguration Day, and I was really late, and I couldn't get it together. I was up hours before, and I just couldn't sort of put on my final shoe and get out the door. Um, but in the context of the church's worship, and in that sacramental force field, um, I try to begin. I bring a lot of turmoil, and I bring a lot of questions and a lot of opinions about my life. I'm 59 now, looking back, looking forward, whatever. Um, and I'm trying in that context of the church to begin with gratitude and praise, or praise and gratitude, to begin with noticing what is. I think it's good to have icons, right? I did I was on a tour this summer in Germany and Switzerland, and then also in France. And I do feel that these Baroque churches, not so much the Baroque, but this kind of, to some extent, even them, I mean, everything is so geometric and so bare of icons. It feels like they're worshiping the God of the Greeks and not the God of the Christians, right? They're worshiping the God of math. So So I do think, icons are important. And in any case, so entering and or if someone is opening their scripture, with praying for an open mind, praying for inspiration, trying to let that be the living thing that it is, and not merely, a tool or a weapon. Um, and certainly not letting it be something dead to be, I don't know, twisted. Um, so I try in church to have that, to begin with praise in some sense, and then move on to empathy, move on to the good, move on to consciously praying for and identifying with the people who are in church with me, the people in Boston, the people in the world, the dead, especially the dead. I feel like praying for the dead is very useful for that, because I don't expect anything in return there. And I have some sense that they are, for the most part, otherwise inert. I'm not sure if that's like, or at least many of them are. So it's very, very important. A friend of mine, a very holy priest, he had a vivid dream. He saw the three Stooges in his dream, and they were sort of on the precipice of some, otherworldly darkness, and they were very sad. And they said, "We made so many people happy, and nobody prays for us." So I have that I think praying for the dead has that kind of, it can also, it's a very beautiful thing. It breaks us out of self-love and makes us, think about whatever. And then I try not to go beyond that, especially because I'm so often late. But I try not to deny myself the Eucharist, even though I'm quite late, and let that be the encounter with truth. That the truth isn't just something to be thought of; it's something really that gives itself to us in a kenotic way. Yeah.
And that seems to connect to a point you made at the very beginning, that there is a need for almost training in beauty, if you will, a need to, you talked about our sins, right? And that we might not be like perfect at recognizing this right away, but there's an ability to grow in this. And is the church the natural home for that? Is it in the life of the church and in the sacraments that we begin to be able to see more clearly, to appreciate beauty? Is there a connection there to what you just described, and being able to appreciate beauty more?
So I can't really speak for other parts of the European world, as well, but in the United States, I think it's literature professors. I think they have historically carried the weight. They have saved the civilization. They have um, they have curated and selected and curated and studied, this canon, and then they've used its beauty to draw people outside themselves. And I think they have carried the civilization more even than the preachers. And um, and I guess you could say the same of the novelists themselves, but I think even more so, high school English teachers and college English teachers, and um, right, how decentering that is. Like when you read, just when you study human nature through literature, how easily we overcome egoistic self-absorption. And I think that's pleases God very much. It shouldn't be this painful tearing all the time.
Yeah, that resonates so much with me, and I'm so grateful for the English teachers in my life who had such an impact on me by opening up entire worlds for me, right, in these books, and allowing that to shape my imagination. And I noticed just how often in your book that various classic works show up. I think your very first chapter deals with the Iliad, um,
Yeah.
which is, as we've gotten further into this conversation, it's no surprise perhaps the role that literature and the great thinkers that have gone before us, the great writers especially, have played in your thought here. I mentioned way at the beginning of this that we'd circle back to it, and we haven't. So I'd be remiss not to. We we haven't talked about the opposite of beauty, and you described trauma as anti-beauty. I found that really intriguing because I think for most people, if you gave them a list of 10 things of give me the opposite of beauty, maybe trauma would show up, but I don't know if it would or not. I mean, certainly people don't think it's beautiful, but using it as kind of the antithesis was really interesting to me. Can you explain a little bit why that is, and maybe how that sheds light on the healing power of true beauty?
Yeah, it's it's a thing, you know. Trauma is a thing. It really is a kick in the head, and um, yeah, I think my definition of trauma is an experience of ugliness, um, that's that seems to confirm the badness of the world and the badness or indifference or non-existence of God in a way that carries a revelatory force. Like it's not just something bad that happens, bad things happen, but um, when the thing begins to acquire a revelatory force or significance, then it's traumatizing. And that revelatory force can be in the mind, in the soul. It can also be something bodily, um, right? And we can be even divided. It might be one and not the other, and two of them and not the third, and that's it gets even more confusing. Um, and also something that maybe that happens to us that shouldn't be so bad if we dwell on it in the wrong way can begin to function for us as the irrefutable proof that I'm doomed, or God or the universe doesn't care, or whatever is. It's hard to put that into words, but the things it can be slight things that while we work on them acquire a kind of traumatic force and then have that. So in the Ethics of Beauty, the first chapter is really a meditation on Jonathan Shea's Achilles in Vietnam. He revolutionized Iliad studies by saying that, hey, this looks just like my Vietnam vets. And incidentally, I find reading Achilles in Vietnam extremely, I don't know what the word is. Maybe painful isn't the right word, but woe is me. I mean, his account of the people suffering and their self-description of their suffering and what they endured or what they did or what they witnessed in combat. It's a hard row to hoe to read that. Um, and for that reason, I waited a long time, 20 years after I'd read Achilles, to read Odysseus in America. And I finally did that this past year on sabbatical. And and the method for healing that they arrived at, in this Boston VFW, not VFW, VA setting, is a beauty, goodness, truth modality. That I didn't know that when I wrote the Ethics of Beauty. It's too painful for me to read that. Trauma is a thing, just it's a yeah. It's an anti-theophany.
Hmm.
So theophany is beauty, or it's beauty is this positive surprise. It's this unmerited generosity that's seems to be just for you, you know, and trauma is just 180 degrees from that.
Indeed. It seems that it's a very interesting day to be having this particular conversation on the Feast of the Transfiguration as an example of beauty, and perhaps the opposite
Yeah,
of trauma there. Um, Dr. Patitsas, this has been an absolutely wonderful conversation. Thank you so much for your time today. I'll have a link to the the book in the description down below. But is there anything else that I should be pointing people towards?
Yeah, I made a movie called Amphilochios, Saint of Patmos. It's a documentary short. You can find it on Vimeo, and it's a very lovely person. And I also just wanted to mention that in church tradition, the Transfiguration occurred exactly 40 days before the crucifixion. So it was that experience of unmerited beauty that was meant to carry them through the traumatization of their Lord and Savior and their friend. And it did to a degree. It did.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Well, I look forward to checking out that documentary, and I'll be sure to have the links in the description down below. But once again, thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me on. I appreciate it.